Okay, so let's dive into one of the strangest stories in all of history.
It really is.
We're talking about how a private business, basically a corporation started by a few merchants in London, somehow became the ruler of an entire continent.
Right, of India.
Hmm.
For over 150 years, this is the story of the British East India Company, the EIC.
It's just an unbelievable trajectory.
It's a huge lesson in what happens when, financial ambition gets combined with military power. It can just completely eclipse governments. When it started in 1600, they had no plans for an empire. None at all.
Right, the initial ambition was just to trade, but even that was, I mean, the scale of it is staggering.
Ah.
The EIC was born from a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I.
Mm-hmm.
And you can think of it like a modern joint stock company. It was a revolutionary idea where merchants pooled their money together to fund these incredibly risky sea voyages.
Sharing the risk, but also sharing the potential reward.
And the main goal.
Spices. They wanted to find a way into the spice trade. Spain and Portugal, they totally dominated the routes for things like pepper and cloves. The English desperately wanted a piece of that action.
And just imagine that journey. I mean, you're sailing for months and months,
Oh, yeah.
going all the way around the southern tip of Africa, facing storms, sickness.
And other ships trying to stop you. It was a brutal, high-stakes game from day one. And when those first ships finally got there, in the early 1600s, they weren't landing on some empty shore.
No, not at all.
Huh.
They arrived at the doorstep of the massive, powerful Mughal Empire.
And that's the context we absolutely have to get. The Mughals weren't some small kingdom. This was a sophisticated, incredibly wealthy empire ruling millions of people.
So the English were the ones who had to ask for permission. They were the supplicants.
Absolutely. The EIC had to approach the Mughal court with a lot of respect. They needed permission from the local rulers just to set up shop and trade. That power dynamic was clear from the start.
So how does a tiny trading company get the leverage it needs to get that permission?
Well, it came down to a show of force, but ironically, against another European power.
Ah.
In 1612, the English Navy defeated a Portuguese fleet in a battle near the port of Surat. And this really showed off their superior naval technology.
And that got the emperor's attention.
It really impressed the Mughal emperor, Jahangir. So by proving they were more powerful than their rivals, the EIC basically secured a contract.
That earned them official trading rights.
Exactly. They set up their first permanent post, which they called a factory.
Which wasn't a factory like we think of it, right? No smokestack.
Right. No, it was really just a fortified warehouse in the city of Surat. But even then, there were strict rules. They had to pay taxes, they had to give expensive gifts to the court, just to keep things running smoothly.
Okay, so the trade is on. What were the hot items? I know it started with spices, but what really made the EIC rich?
Indian textiles. That
Oh.
was the real game changer.
Textiles.
Yeah.
Like fabric.
Yeah, this created a fashion revolution back in Europe. People went crazy for Indian cotton. We're talking about these beautifully colored, patterned fabrics like calico and chintz.
They were much lighter than what people were using.
Way lighter and more comfortable than the heavy wool that everyone wore in Europe. But
Yeah.
it wasn't just finished fabrics. They also exported raw silk for the luxury market.
And there were a couple of other really key industrial exports, right?
Two crucial ones: indigo, which was this deep blue dye that was essential for the European clothing industry,
Okay.
and saltpeter, which sounds obscure, but it was the key ingredient needed to make gunpowder.
So the EIC was trading in goods that fueled both European fashion and European wars.
Exactly. And to manage all this growth, they needed bigger bases. So they set up these major trading centers they called presidencies.
And these presidencies basically grew into some of the biggest modern cities we know today.
They did. We're talking about Mumbai, Chennai, which started as Madras and was protected by Fort St. George in Kolkata, which they set up in the really fertile region of Bengal.
And these weren't just forts. They were becoming like little cities.
They were complex economic hubs. You had the warehouses, the offices, the homes for the British employees, but crucially, they acted like magnets, pulling in thousands of local Indian craftsmen and laborers who needed to live near the company to work.
And this is where things start to change, fundamentally. Because as those warehouses are filling up with all this wealth, silk, tea, gold, the merchants start to realize that the only thing that really guarantees their investment is military force.
They needed protection, not just from their European rivals like the French, but also from local rulers who were getting, a bit tired of the EIC's attitude.
And they couldn't just call up the British Army from thousands of miles away.
Impossible. So they did something that is just wild to think about today. They created their own private army.
A for-profit corporation with its own military.
Exactly. The officers were British, but the vast majority of the soldiers were Indian recruits. They were called sepoys.
So wait, if most of the soldiers were Indian, how did the company keep them loyal? Why would a sepoy fight for a foreign company, sometimes against other Indian rulers?
It really came down to professionalism and reliable pay. Money. It was often better and more consistent than what local armies were offering. They provided good training, a clear rank structure, like in European armies. For a lot of men, it was a path to a stable income.
And that army just grew and grew.
To an incredible size. By the mid-1700s, the EIC's private army was actually larger than Britain's entire national army.
Wow.
And once you have that kind of military muscle, you can stop politely asking for things and start demanding them.
And the one moment where that all comes to a head, the point of no return, is the Battle of Plassey.
1757. This is the definitive turning point. It happened in Bengal, which was the richest province in the whole Mughal Empire.
The local ruler, the Nawab Sirajuddaula, he'd had enough of the EIC and was trying to limit their power.
So Robert Clive led the EIC forces against him. But the victory wasn't really a military victory. It was more of a political coup.
What do you mean?
Clive was very clever. Before the battle, he made secret deals with key generals in the Nawab's own army.
He got them to switch sides.
Convinced them to betray their ruler during the battle. So the result was this quick, humiliating defeat for the Nawab. The EIC now controlled Bengal.
But they didn't officially take over? Not yet.
No, instead they installed a puppet ruler. Someone who had the title but had to do exactly what the company told him to do.
And that is the moment the EIC stops being just a trading company and becomes a ruling power.
It's the beginning of their political rule, and once they were in charge, they found the ultimate money-making machine. In 1765, the Mughal emperor, who was much weaker by this point, was forced to grant the EIC the right to collect land taxes. This was called the Diwani.
The Diwani. And this completely changed their business model.
Fundamentally, before this, the EIC had to bring silver from England to India to buy Indian goods.
They were spending British money.
Exactly. But after 1765, that just stopped.
So let me get this straight. They started using the tax money they collected from Indian farmers to buy the very goods they were shipping back to Europe to sell for a profit.
That is exactly right. They were essentially getting Indian goods for free, using India's own wealth to fund their profits. It was a self-funding machine of extraction.
That's incredibly profitable for the company, but for the people of Bengal, I mean.
It was devastating. The EIC demanded incredibly high taxes. Their focus was now just on maximizing revenue.
And if the crops failed,
They still demanded the same high taxes. This led to a horrible famine in Bengal, massive death tolls. The company cared more about its profits than the lives of the people it was now governing.
now while all this is happening inside India, they're also fighting rivals on the outside.
Right. The French East India Company was their main competitor. They fought a series of conflicts in India called the Carnatic Wars.
And these weren't just isolated fights.
No, they were almost always tied to the bigger wars happening between Britain and France back in Europe. It shows how connected everything was. But the British EIC eventually won, pushing the French out and becoming the dominant European power in the region.
And the EIC's influence didn't stop there. It actually stretched all the way across the Atlantic and, believe it or not, helped spark the American Revolution.
This is such a surprising connection. By the 1770s, the EIC had a huge surplus of tea sitting in its London warehouses. They couldn't sell it. The company was in a serious financial crisis.
So to bail them out, the British government passed the Tea Act in 1773.
This law let the EIC sell its tea directly to the American colonies at a really low price, cheaper than smuggled tea. But, and this is the key, it still included that small tax from Parliament.
And the American colonists hated that tax. No taxation without representation.
They weren't interested in a bargain if it meant agreeing that Parliament could tax them. So their response was the Boston Tea Party. They boarded the EIC's ships and threw the company's tea into the harbor.
Wow. So the American Revolution was kicked off by a protest against a bailout for this massive company.
That's the link. A global company's financial problems became the catalyst for a revolution.
Back in India, working for the EIC was the quickest way for a young British guy to get ridiculously wealthy. They were called nabobs back home.
And that was not a compliment. It's a version of the Mughal title Nawab, but in Britain it was a derogatory term. These men would come back with these huge fortunes, often gained through corruption, and live these wildly extravagant lives.
And that made people in Britain suspicious. They started looking sideways at the EIC, figuring something wasn't right.
Correct. They suspected, and they were right, that corruption was everywhere. Bribes, illegal private trading, and on top of that, the company itself kept having to go back to the government asking for bailouts.
Which is strange given how much money they were supposedly making.
Exactly. So the British government started to step in and take more control. The era of corporate freedom was ending.
When did that happen?
In 1813, Parliament ended the EIC's monopoly on trade with India. Then, in 1833, they lost their monopoly on the very profitable China tea trade. The company basically stopped being a trading company at all.
So what was it then?
It became just an administrative body. It managed land and collected taxes for the British government, but it was being watched very closely by politicians in London.
And the final nail in the coffin was the Indian Rebellion of 1857.
A massive, violent uprising. It involved the sepoys, the Indian soldiers and civilians who rose up against company rule.
The rebellion was put down, but it was so bloody, and the company's mismanagement was so clear.
The British government decided a private business was just not capable of governing an empire. It was too much.
So in 1858, the East India Company was officially dissolved.
Completely. All of its territories, its armies, all its administrative functions were transferred directly to the British Crown. Queen Victoria took direct control. And this is the moment that starts the British Raj.
So it began with merchants looking for spices and ended with the creation of a massive empire that changed the world, sparked a revolution in America, and completely altered the history of South Asia.
The EIC really is the ultimate historical case study.
It shows what happens when a powerful, private, for-profit company gets its own army and starts acting like a government. And raises a question we still deal with today, how much power should we allow modern global corporations to have?
See you next time.